Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Disciplining Comics, Teaching in the Humanities with Graphic Histories. My name is Andy Mink. I am the Vice President for Education Programs at the Center. I want to thank you for joining us tonight, as well as our guest, Trevor Getz from San Francisco State University. It's always a pleasure to have so many teachers from across the country join us and to see familiar faces, not only from face-to-face work we've done, but a lot of these virtual sessions and webinar sessions. It's the start of 2020, and we hope that the content and the approaches that we share are helpful in your classroom, relevant in your classroom, and particularly tonight with such a hands-on and I think probably easily applicable session for a variety of humanities topics. We would love to hear how you might use this and ways that you might apply this in your own teaching for the next handful of months. National Humanities Center is located in Durham, North Carolina. We've been there since 1978 and each year welcome a fellowship class of university professors and humanists who come to the center if they're selected and from Labor Day to Memorial Day, work on the best in humanities scholarship. Really, in some ways, I think this is a laboratory. It's a place not of Bunsen burners and lab coats and beakers and calipers, but it's a place in which we use words and resources and primary documents and art and paintbrushes to really try to understand the world in a much better place. And maybe that's the ways in which the humanities can be the most applicable. I want to pause just for a moment. I've noticed that my friend Craig Perrier is asking if we should have audio, and I want to make sure that you're hearing my voice. Can anybody please chime in the chat box if you can hear my voice? Everybody makes sense of me? Yeah, thanks, Annie. Craig, that must be on your end, so I would encourage you to, of course, you can't hear me say this, but I'd encourage you to check your volume. Thanks, everybody. If you're ever in North Carolina, if you're ever able to come by the center, we would always welcome you to stop by and visit with us, or you can visit our website. We've spent the last 6 months redoing our website, really making all of our content searchable and indexable and speak to each other. Our website now includes not only the scholarly programs and the work created by our scholars, but also our education materials. So for example, if you go to our website, if you're interested in tonight's session and you'd like to have some follow-up materials, you might search for graphic novel and you'll find a webinar that we did 2 years ago with Jesse Costantino from University of New Mexico. Jesse has a different session and perhaps even a different approach to the use of graphic novels in the classroom, but this is a way for you to find connected and relevant materials and perhaps apply it in a variety of ways. This is also a reminder that we are recording our webinars, including tonight's session, and generally those recordings are online and available to you within about 48 hours. I've found and I've heard from teachers that it's really helpful to spend this live time talking and discussing, learning from experts like Trevor, but then it's nice to go back and linger and pause and break things up and perhaps even share some of those segments with your students in your classroom. A couple of quick announcements in terms of our webinar series. We currently have one session for the rest of the spring that's got some seats available. That's the April 21st session with Akram Qadir. Akram is a former fellow at the center and also a professor of history at NC State. Right now, last I checked just a few moments ago, we've got 58 seats left. I'd encourage you to sign up if you're interested in understanding the modern Middle East, which seems particularly relevant now. I'd also like to remind you that our session with Johnny Smith from Georgia Tech has been rescheduled for April 28th from an original December date. And we do have a bonus track webinar scheduled this spring that is a session in which all of you who attend 100% of the sessions you register for are invited to a special VIP link and can join us for what I think again will be a very relevant session. We're working with Carolyn Denard from Georgia State on the life and writings of Toni Morrison. So attend those that you sign up for and you'll get that special VIP link by the end of this semester. A couple other announcements I'd like to make. That includes the open application period for the 10-day Summer Institute held at the National Humanities Center. In July, we'll be welcoming 36 teachers from across the country to join us for Contested Territory, America's Role in Southeast Asia, 1945 to 1975. Our intent in these 10 days is to work with scholars to understand the complex fabric of Southeast Asia and then position the American involvement in Vietnam War inside of that understanding. We're accepting applications. This does include a $2,100 stipend, and we'll be taking applications until March the 1st, then announce who we can select for the Institute within just 2 or 3 weeks after that. We also are pleased to announce the opening of 5 new courses in our online course catalog. Each of these courses earn up to 35 professional development hours. So if you are working in a school district or in a state in which these webinars are helpful in gaining that CEU credit or those points, they likely would equal to about 5 of these webinars for one of these courses. So if you'd like to spend a little bit more time learning and being more immersive with our scholars, please sign up for those courses. The next session starts on March the 9th. And finally, if you're located in Southern California like Brennan Ivy is, we would love to have you come out and meet Libby and Mike and myself at the Huntington Library. In early March, we'll be co-hosting a 2-day session at the Huntington Education Summit. This is in part a celebration of the 100-year anniversary, the centennial of the Huntington. The Humanities Center will be leading a session on teaching civil discourse with the humanities. And we would love to meet you in person, shake your hand, and work with you face to face. Finally, I want to thank our Teacher Advisory Council for all of their hard work. As I scroll through the roster tonight, I see many of our current and former Teacher Advisory Council members with us tonight. People like Carl Rosen near Philadelphia, Scott Smith over in Knoxville, Tennessee, Michelle Kane and Camille Bernstein. Thank you so much for all the work that you've done with us. It's important for us to, I think, stay connected with the realities of the classroom and schools and the districts. And I mean that instructionally, I mean that in a curricular sense, and I mean that politically. Just the daily grind of being a teacher and discovering the teacher leadership agency that you have inside of that is an important part and goal of what we do. As a matter of fact, you joining us tonight is a big part of that agency, I think, essentially coming to join us after work. And your participation is going to be an important part of tonight. As Trevor leads the session, as I, as the moderator, interact with him, I will also be bringing in questions and comments that you drop into the chat box. Please use that chat box at the bottom of your control panel to register thoughts, to share URLs, to share with us what you might do in your own classroom. And again, what I'll be doing is bringing that into the larger conversation, and I'll make sure that all of your questions get answered. That's all an introduction to tonight's session. I anticipate this being a very provocative one. I anticipate being able to really see a lot of connections across the humanities disciplines. I'm very pleased that Trevor Getz, who is professor of history and the director of the Initiative for Public Humanities at San Francisco State, is able to join us. I'd also like to introduce Craig Perrier, who is in Fairfax County Schools in Virginia. Craig is a member of this year's Teacher Advisory Council. And what we've asked him to do tonight, and we'll be doing this throughout the spring, is to be our TA. That is to say, he'll be in the chat box, he'll be making comments, he'll be asking questions, he'll be responding to you and maybe some of the thoughts that you have. And we have asked him, given him some early advance connection to the PowerPoint, we have asked him to come up with some ways that he might use it in the classroom, and he's going to be dropping that into the chat box. So look for Craig. You can speak to him directly, interact with him, and let him sort of lead that conversation that's just underneath what Trevor will be sharing. And of course, it's good news, and I think it's will say a lot for the way they interact, that Trevor and Craig have presented together before and have worked together and know each other's work. So I'm pleased that they'll be able to essentially co-lead tonight's session. So Trevor, I'm going to unmute you. I'm going to welcome you to the stage. Thank you for joining us from the West Coast. Hey, Trevor, can you hear me?
Yeah, can everybody hear me?
Fantastic. We can hear you. You sound great. Again, I appreciate you joining us. I'm going to hand the mouse over to you and advance your first slide just to give you a little bit of an introduction. And I'd like to ask you a question really to start this, and then I'm going to turn it over to you and let you entertain us for the next 75 minutes or so. Trevor, here's a question that came to my mind as I've reviewed your slides and I considered what I might want to pull out of tonight's session. And it actually comes from the title that you shared with us, and that is you've got comics and you've got graphic histories. Tell us the difference between comics and graphic work. What is the difference to us, to a non-expert in the comic world?
Well, sure. I mean, that's a pretty good place to start. I do want to say thanks to you and to Libby and to Craig, who I love working with, for helping me out here tonight, and hi to everybody out there. And let me start with that question because words matter. If anybody knows that words matter, we know words matter, right? And words signify something. And to tell you the truth, there's a lot of contested language still out there about using comics or graphic novels or different terminology. Let me tell you how I'm using both of these terms now, and you're going to see that coming out. I consider comics to be a medium. It is a multimodal medium. As you'll see, it communicates through two modes, but it is a particular medium, just like film is a medium, just like the written story is a medium, etc. And then a graphic history is a genre within that medium. And it so happens that graphic histories, which I'll define in a few minutes, are the medium that's important to me and that I can speak from. And we're going to be working a lot tonight with comics in general. But in every example, when we look at how to decode comics, I'm going to be using examples that are graphic histories. And so I think you can use this more broadly as a little bit of comic theory, but definitely graphic histories are what I'm going to be showing you. And as Ginger Park just noted, that teachers in their school district are using Miss Marvel. Hey, I'm a comic book lover. If you could look into my room, you would see a flood of history books and a flood of comic books, and they meet somewhere in the middle, and that's the metaphor. Now, thankfully, you can't see my room, and thankfully, my 17-year-old who just got home from school upstairs has agreed to be quiet, hopefully. I also can't see you. I don't know, precisely what you all think, but I'm going to be watching that chat box. I imagine some of you are comic enthusiasts like me, love the medium. I imagine that some of you are interested in the way in which comics are shown pretty extensively in pretty solid studies with large sample sizes to be a gateway for literacy for many, but not all students. And I know some of you are probably getting your head just around the idea that comics are a serious thing. And I want to just tell you my philosophy. I love comics. I love very serious, theory-laden, heavy historical texts. I love sci-fi, especially. I love The Grapes of Wrath. Each medium uses a different approach, and hopefully, what we'll be able to show in the next few years is that learning in one medium does transfer pretty well to another. I won't say that we know that for sure yet, but also understanding that each medium has its own rules and codes will help. And hey, Tanya, thanks for, it makes me really warm to know that you use Aben and the Important Men in your class. I'll just say that my 5 minutes of teaching adrenaline are almost up. So hopefully I can settle down, and that did help me settle down a little bit. But I want to show you the next slide, which is slightly different, if I can, in fact, do that. All right, take a look, right? A lot of you may remember this kind of thing. This is from a game that most of us, I think, know well, called Chutes and Ladders, or in some places, Snakes and Ladders. The ladders go up, the snakes or the chutes take you down. Here on step number 16 is a boy reading history. We know history is good here. Maybe not as good as science, because there's a microscope up in step 63. Makes me a little annoyed, but so be it in their judgment. But history is good, but history is also boring according to this game, because here we have a parable. The boy is is reading the comic instead of reading the history that he's supposed to be reading. And so he's going to go down the chute to wear the dunce cap. And of course, you know, this is something that's familiar to all of us who know the history of comics. After all, for a period, comics were seen to be a corrupting force for the youth. They were seen to be something that was dangerous, something that could reading them could really harm you or harm your children. No teacher would have really thought about teaching with comics. And of course, in the 1950s, there were, admittedly, those teachers who were rebellious. There were comics out there, put out there by, amongst other things, the SNCC and the Civil Rights Movement. But in general, the exception proves the rule. Comics were a bad thing. And we've come a long way since then. And here's evidence that we've come a long way. This, if you haven't seen it, is a whole section of reviews of graphic histories, the medium that I'm talking about and the genre I'm talking about here in the American Historical Review. And those of you who are history teachers, social studies teachers, on that sort of side of things will know that this is an eminent journal, perhaps the top journal, or acknowledge the top journal in the discipline of history in the United States. And as of December 2018, they created a section once a year to read serious graphic histories and to review them as you would review a history monograph.
When did they start doing that, Trevor?
This year is actually really literally the first
Yeah,
the decision to do that, and we have to give a lot of the credit to Alec Lichtenstein, who's the
yeah.
editor here, for wanting to break the mold. And part of what's interesting is that he wanted to break the mold in this aspect, just as he was breaking the mold in terms of ensuring diversity of representation of authors of articles, just as he was trying to break the mold in terms of acknowledging other media, movies, and things that we work in. This is part of I think, a broader conversation about what constitutes the discipline of history. And of course, it is happening in other disciplines, each in their own way. A second one is going to come out. So there were about eight volumes reviewed here, 8 graphic histories. A second one is coming out. Actually, should have just come out in December 2019. I haven't seen it yet. But the other thing that I want to do here is just to define graphic history for a second, as I promised I would. So graphic history, as I said, is part of the medium of comics. Comics are defined as sequential art and text integrated together. So 2 modes, art and text, in sequence, integrated together. That's a comic, no matter what the particular topic may be. And we're talking about history, so we're talking about intentional interpretations of the past. Now, you could ask, can some of the Marvel work that's set in the past be considered a graphic history? You know, I'm not one who sets rules, and I think arguably, yes. You know, arguably we can look at fictionalization and the way that it works with history. But in general, we're looking at accounts of the past that intend to interpret it, that intend to acknowledge and to engage certain ideas of authority, whether that's a person's own memory through a memoir, or whether it's you know, citations and footnotes. There are also a number of things out there that purport to be graphic histories that I think are pretty good histories, but are really bad comics, and they're really not my favorite. And you'll see why I think that you have to be a lover of comics in order to work with the graphic history. But again, I want to undiscipline here for a second. I just want to point out, because this is very important, that just because something is a memoir or a graphic history, as you all know, doesn't mean that it's not going to be useful in your English language class, or your foreign language class, or any other humanities class. And the skills we'll be talking about today will, I think, fit across disciplines pretty well. Craig, I don't think I've missed any important questions yet. Is that right? You can
No, it
just,
looks good. Thank you. Thank you for asking.
all right, good. If I do, I saw some people loving comic books that I also loved, so that was great. All right, here we have poor Alice. Poor Alice lives in the cul-de-sac. Richard Thompson, who sadly passed away, created a cul-de-sac. And Alice is reading the comic book with her brother Petey, who's telling her. In fact, in this case, it's a comic strip, which is within the medium, but a different genre. And poor Alice sees all these cats within the comic strip, and makes the obvious that the one cat in the first panel is different from the cat in the last panel. And why not? I mean, in many ways, that actually makes perfect sense. In most other media, multiple cats in a piece of media, it would be multiple cats. And yet Petey knows, because Petey has read comics for a while, that the cat in the beginning is the cat in the end as well. And I love the sort of inception that's going on here by Richard Thompson, who's giving us a reading of a comic book strip within a comic strip. It's the kind of thing that you can do with comic strips that's so fun. But the message that we should get here, of course, is that there are different levels of reading a comic, no matter what genre it is. There's a level in which everybody knows how to read a comic, everybody who's older than Alice, right? Just like everybody knows how to read a poem, or everybody knows how to read a textbook. Yeah, sure. But what we want our students to be able to do is to be able to decode comics in the same way that you want them to be able to decode a piece of literature, or a painting, or any other medium. And to do that, what we're really doing is we're helping them engage the richness that is there within the medium, to go deep into meaning, and then to hopefully apply that meaning to their own world. That's what we want students to be able to do. And so the question, how do I read a comic book? And I'm going to spend much of today kind of abstractly talking about reading comic books. I'm going to start with theory, and then I'm going to get a lot more concrete, and then more concrete about the classroom. And then there'll be time at the end, I promise, for us to go over different activities that you can actually import into your classroom to use with students. But I'm making a couple of propositions here that you'll have to see if they're sustained or not, whether my claims are accurate. The first is that decoding is just a vitally important skill. It doesn't matter what students are learning to decode. Once they can decode, they can derive meaning. And a second thing I want to propose here is that learning to decode is transferable when the teacher is intentional about that. So if you teach students to decode with comic books of any form first, that is transferable to decoding poems or anything else if you help students to make the connections. I can't prove that, by the way, but that's what I'm learning from the teachers I'm working with. But so why learn to decode with comics first? So two propositions here about why comics are great for helping your students to learn to decode or read thickly or recognize semiotics or whatever you want. And then I'll pause for a second. The first proposition is that comics do appear to be unladen with the heavy baggage of intellectual text at first. They are hiding the broccoli. The cheese is that comics are fun, but underneath that cheese is the broccoli, that comics are rich with literal and figurative representation. And the second is that comics do give students two kinds of media rather than just one from which to derive meaning. And so they can go back and forth between the art and the text. And that provides a really good entree for them to dealing with both. So Craig has been busy posting some of the sites where you can see a lot of really good kinds of organizers. I've got a couple of links at the end as well that I'll introduce you to, but you'll see that there's a lot of opportunity. All right, here's this really heavy thing called theory. I know. I'm a historian. We don't actually preference theory. Some of you may preference theory more than I do because you're really in the humanities. But what I'm introducing in terms of theory are just some core ideas that are going to help you to teach your students to decode. And You can take this to your students, you can share it with them, feel free, or you can just know it yourself, and sort of it can help inform the way you work. So let's start with with the debate. A debate that I'm going to use two of my favorite scholars of comics, Scott McCloud and Nick Souzanis, to represent. So here's Scott McCloud. He represents himself on the page. Understanding Comics is a great book to help you or to help your students enter the world of comics. And so here McCloud is showing that creators create, and they want the ideas that they create to enter the minds of their audience. If they write, they use a pencil, they create letters. Those letters go, oh, that was really weird, sorry about that. If they if they're musicians, they use music. If they are filmmakers, they use film. But in any case, they obviously want to convert their ideas into the reader or into the audience. And for Souzanis, comics take a pathway then from the creator who creates a message to that message getting into the mind of the reader. But here's Scott McCloud, who has some doubt about that. And McCloud, sorry, not Scott McCloud, Nick Souzanis. And Souzanis is, we could say, being somewhat affected by Bourdieu and other theorists, Roland Barthes, who talk about the idea that really the audience is creating for themselves as they sit there and they view the artwork or they listen to the artwork, that in their eyes, something different is happening than the creator has necessarily created. And the only way to reach across the gap is to appreciate imagination and the power and importance of imagination in the way that we communicate. Now, there's disagreement here as to whether the author or the reader is more powerful. But there's agreement that what will stretch across the gap is an ability for both to imagine being in the mind of the other. So how do those messages get across? Well, in comics, the most important thing that sets comics apart, or at least the first important thing that sets comics apart, is multimodality. And multimodality is very, very simple. It means you're using both art and text to communicate. And art and text do work differently, although they have big overlaps. But appreciating the work done by each is your first step towards really reading a comic and decoding it. I've given a page here from Mouse by Art Spiegelman. I'd be interested to see if any of you are using Spiegelman in your class. Mouse is an incredible book, and I'm going to come back to it later, although it's often used in very, very different ways. But Spiegelman knows how to create a page in which he does incredible work with both art and text. Nick Souzanis does as well. Some of you may actually recognize the painting on which this page from The Fragile Network is based. It's quite a famous Japanese painting about, in fact, a tsunami that hits the coast. In this painting, we have really three pieces of information working together. The first is our establishing text, which tells us very factually in the way that, in some ways text is so precise. It's so beautiful. It communicates so explicitly. And here we have some dense pieces of information in text that communicates a simple idea to us about global warming. And what Souzanis does is he then takes us into a chart that illustrates this information using the kind of infographics that we rely on to demonstrate in a visual sense the way the information is sort of laid out. And then that in turn becomes the painting from which Souzanis has taken this cyclone to illustrate the cyclone that is moving towards Japan. And Souzanis has chosen to replace the moon with the globe itself in order to demonstrate that this is a global issue, and then to pull us forward to the end by talking about a cyclone in text and then showing again the cyclone as an image. Here, the text and the art are working pretty seamlessly together to help us get an idea of what we're going through and how this is a threat. So importantly, the feature of comics that they are in order or sequential helps us to do this work by causing us to rely upon the reality and the imagination of the reader as well as the creator. And the idea through which this function is called closure. And closure is all about how the comic book page works. So as we'll talk about in a minute, when we get down to looking at the elements of a page, comics are made up of panels. These panels may or may not have a boundary around them. They may be easily bounded, they may not be. They may look quite different, but we know they're made up in panels. That's obvious. But the panels are not alone on a page. The panels are there with the negative space, with the blank space, which we call gutters. Gutters may be thin, they may be large. We're going to see a bunch of different gutters here today. But gutters help us to engage the work that the comic needs done. So here you see 5 images of a man on a page. What's this man doing? Are they in fact 5 men or 1 man? Will we make Alice's mistake or will we not? How do we know that that man is moving? How do we connect the motions? How do we see the exercise that he's doing? Our mind is able to do that, and it's something that comics call upon us to do. They call upon us to add in some of the action. So here we get back to that Susanus MacLeod kind of discussion about who's doing the work. By calling upon us to do that work, they engage us in understanding and thinking slowly about the page and the way the whole page is constructed. Panels, therefore, form the primary constituent element of the graphic novel, but their silent partner is the gutter between them. The panel is bounded. It has a boundary. The gutter really doesn't. It generally wanders all over the place. The reader can take the gutter where they want, whereas in the panel, the creator has more power to tell us what's happening. Panels are the place where the action seems to happen, but gutters are places where we make it happen. The vocabulary within the panel, of course, includes both the art and the text. And the art and the text meets within the panel. And the text itself is often offset. It is pulled to the side in a balloon. So, what are the balloons? The balloons are containers for text, but they're also things that are supposed to speak to us themselves, to give us a sense of the transition between the art and the text. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a second. I wanted first to just give you an example of gutters. Okay, I'm going to try to play this off, but the truth is that this slide was supposed to be 1 slide earlier and I messed up. But here's please laugh along with me. Here's a great example of a gutter where there's a man clearly being attacked with an axe, and then in the next in the next panel there's a scream, and you know what happens in between. Although 1,000 different things could happen in between, as MacLeod says. But this is a good example, and if you do use this presentation with your students, be sure to flip those 2 slides. I'm really sorry about that. But let's get to these balloons now. Take a look at these balloons. Here are some balloons that are doing a lot of work for us. They're doing a lot of work for us. And let's just take a look at each one, because they're each clearly representative of something that's ingrained, and also there's something that speaks to us because of conventions that we've learned. So let's take the bottom 2 balloons. I love the bottom 2 balloons, and just ask. So in one balloon we see somebody yelling timber, and we can think about how we know that they're yelling. And this is actually a great way to start with students, to have them actually just look at some balloons and the way they talk. And here we know that they're yelling timber for two reasons, both because the text is really big and with big exclamation points, and because it's really, really jagged. So the art is doing some work for us, right? We know that jagged things are angry or scary, but the text is also doing some of it. Similarly, if we look at the balloon to the left, oh, it's you. We know this is icy for two reasons. One is that it literally looks icy. And the second is the italicization of the word you, which again is something that helps us to know what's going on. It's a convention that we've taken from text. All of these are part of the way that comics signify meaning to us. You know, I'm going to make an assertion that it makes sense even with high school students to go back for a second and to look at art. And I see a lot of people recommending different graphic histories of different sorts, some of them more sort of fictionalized and fantasy-like Boxers and Saints, which nevertheless is, I think, a very, very strong work from a brilliant, brilliant creator. And others like March that strive very, very hard to be serious histories to the degree that the creators went through the SNCC archives in order to actually get literal words to put in people's mouths who are at these sorts of meetings that that are the subject of the book. And in both cases, these are great histories, but they're also important pieces of art. And pulling students back to think about how art speaks has to be part of how we use comics in the classroom. Otherwise, we're just having the students sort of read illustrated histories or illustrated novels.
And
Molly
so
Bang does this
it,
work so well. Yeah, let me stop. Yeah.
yeah, well, I'd like to ask you just a quick question, and actually, I'm going to bring in a comment that Scott Smith made. Scott is a librarian in Knoxville, Tennessee, former teacher advisory council member, and earlier in the chat, he mentioned that, and Scott, please correct me if I represent what you typed in incorrectly, but it seemed like he was suggesting that when he shares graphic novels with his students, that one of the things that is challenging is that they tend to just look at pictures rather than decode the many modalities as you've described them. Do you have some suggestions on, and that may just be an instructional developmental thing, but are there other ways to get students to linger on and spend time with these multiple modalities?
I mean, I'm so glad that you said that because something that I'm going to get to later is just how important it is to model reading slowly.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really hard, right? Yeah. I have a for the classroom. I have a couple of different parts of the workshop that we're going to talk about that are ways to get students to read slowly. I hope we have to do it, we have to model it, etc. But there are two questions here. The one is a really interesting point that recent research is showing that young people read the images first when they read comics, or at least young people who are comic natives look at the images and neglect the text. And many of the rest of us look at the text and the images are really secondary. And that's interesting, although I don't know what to do with that piece of information yet. But there's some pretty good studies coming out of Boston University and a couple other places about that. But the second thing is that students read the art as something pleasant to look at, and don't want to, they don't want that pleasure to be taken away from them, which is something that they fear, I think, by being made to decode it. And so we have to make that pleasurable as well. And I am very optimistic that those of you who are real teachers and not college professors who were never taught how to teach are going to be able to make this stuff fun as well. I will tell you that my students, I emphasize a lot how much fun we should be having in reading these comics. And, and,
Yeah.
and, and, and here, here is an example. Here's an example of a case in point. And yeah, so Sarah Radke says students need some visual thinking strategies. What do you see? What do you see that makes you say that? I mean, I hope we'll be doing some of that later, but also, right here we could do that. And if I had you in front of me and we were communicating, I would say, Little Red Riding Hood. This is from Molly Bang's Picture This, spectacular book. Little Red Riding Hood, she's much safer, clearly, in the left-hand picture than the right-hand picture. Why? So I'm going to tell you what Molly Bang says to us, although it's a lot more fun to play around with this with your students. The first is that in the left-hand picture, there's a lot of white space. Little Red Riding Hood is big. She's in the front. And all of the angles are 90-degree angles. Everything is straight. And Molly Bang actually makes the argument, or in fact, this is theory that comes out of the art world, that these are cues to us that things are safe. These are embedded in us. They're ingrained in us. Or we learn them very, very early indeed. And then here on the right, Little Red Riding Hood is in danger. And it's partly because we can see the wolf, obviously. But it's also these acute angles, these dangerous acute angles, just as we knew when we saw that balloon with the jagged edges. We know that these angles signify danger. And she's lost in the background, right? She's small. Everything around her is large. And if you have students look at paintings from Renaissance Europe, or at least the Romantic era, or if you have them look at work coming out of other parts of the world, there is some universality to the kinds of things that tell us that somebody is safe or in danger. And so students need to stop and look at pictures and kind of think about and try to master that. So take a look, if you will, at these 2 pages from Jacques Tardy's It Was the War of the Trenches. But while you do, I'm going to read to you something completely different. Or not completely different, but a little bit different. I'm going to read to you 2 paragraphs from a textbook, one of the most widely used textbooks in the high school world history classroom, about the beginning and the end of the First World War. So here's the one that's set in 1914, the beginning of the war. Throughout Europe, people greeted the outbreak of war with parades and hopes for a quick victory. Very few imagined that their side would not win, and no one foresaw that everyone would lose. So here's the other, 1918. The war left more dead and wounded and more physical destruction than any previous conflict. It is estimated that between 8 million and 10 million people died, almost all of them young men. Perhaps twice that many returned home, wounded, gassed, or shell-shocked, many of them injured for life. In addition, the war created millions of refugees. Now, I consult for a very large world history project for the high school classroom. I've worked with teachers to see how they annotate texts like that. There's a lot of good strategies. And this is solid textbook stuff, right? It's workmanlike, it's brief, it's memorizable if you want them to memorize. The information is literal in front of you. It's packed in there. And now let's go back to Jacques Tardy for a second. The information sprawls over 2 pages, like lavishly so. And it speaks in a visual language that asks us to slow down and to consider. Even though nobody is moving, we can see motion in 1914. We can see that it's loud, it's packed with text as well. The text is exuberant. The lines are bold. Everything is in motion. There's a singular large message written on the wall, general mobilization. Everyone is whole and healthy and ready to go to war. And 1918, by contrast, there are very few words. In fact, only the words needed to communicate numbers. It's actually become quite silent. You can feel that silence. Nobody is whole, or almost nobody is whole, only the doctors and the nurse. The page has these big splotches of gray. It's a very gray page. And everything is somewhat disfigured. It's quiet, it's still, right? Now, students working with the 2 paragraphs are going to take something important away, especially if it's really well scaffolded. But students working here with the text and the art together in this comic book format, reading the page slowly, annotating the page, sort of the way that I've annotated it here, and we'll look at this more again, can actually learn history, right? And they can actually take it away with them and apply it. Something that has worked for that hard is internalized. It becomes something that is savored and debatable. The artist I work with the most is Liz Clark. And I just wanted to show you just images from Liz Clark for a little bit. Um, you know, there is a whole there's a whole body of theory that uses really big, complex words to tell you how a particular comic book page is constructed or isn't. But students aren't really going to engage with that. But they can engage with things like viewpoint and perspective. In each panel, Liz chooses a different focal point. She goes up high, she goes down low. She shows something from different perspectives that might be visuals from different people. She uses different ways of breaking up the panels in order to show that things are disjointed or things are leading into each other. She shows what it looks like from a supplicant or for somebody in power. She establishes the story before zooming in. And here, one more page from Liz. If I press the right button. There we go. Oops, now I pressed 2. Sorry about that. Let's go back for a second. Here's a page where she's had to make decisions about the text, but to do so artistically. What does the font looks like, right? So this is an intentional decision that you can ask students to read slowly. Why this particular font, right? Why divide up the balloons into 2 instead of 1? What does this particular balloon in the second panel look like? What is it intended to look like? Why is it written in that way? And actually, that one is the decision there to go with sort of a mixed all caps lowercase kind of mode had to do in part with the way that Latin works. And Liz explains that to some degree in the book Debating Truth. And then over on the right, you can see different panels that have different colors for the balloons. And the reason that that's there is because different people are thinking, different people are talking. And she wants to show how we're going kind of back and forth. So the artist is making all of these decisions and they're all meaningful. And sometimes the artist really gets to run free. And a page communicates an idea entirely without text. And to me, to some degree, this is one of the signs of when a comic book or a graphic history is a serious comic book and not just an illustrated kind of history. The story here, this is at the end of Liz and my comic book, Abin and the Important Men. The story here is that our heroine, Abina Mansa, would have, the argument we're making, faded from history and been ignored, except that she forced herself into this courtroom and onto history's pages. And so here we can see that argument taking a life artistically. Liz has actually used a representation of the actual book that details her courtroom battle. And here she is coming out of it and appearing to the student who's reading that she has made herself become real and appear by doing this act in the past, which is one of the key arguments that we're making. And Liz is able to do this just art. I don't know if I've missed any questions. I've seen Craig posting lots of really great ideas and a couple
Yeah,
of points like from Chris Jimenez. But did I miss any questions? Oh, I see
that,
there's one from Joel, or really Joel's wife.
that's correct. And,
I'm going to go with that one. Do you?
that's exactly what I'd like you to do. And Rachel, who is with Joel in Illinois, is asking about the use of political cartoons and how that may be a similar approach or have a different kind of process as students work with them.
I mean, it is really similar, right? I mean, you know, whether political cartoons are comics or not is debated because they're usually not sequential multi-panel. They're usually a single panel, although sometimes they're multi-panel. And often when they're multi-panel, those panels aren't meant to be in sequence. They're meant to represent sort of different opinions, but sometimes they are. And that's really meaningless. You know, there's a lot of good work on political cartoons and other cartoons. Marianne Rett from Monmouth is just coming out with a book about American cartoons that represent Islam. To some degree, they have to be read a little bit differently, but they can be read again for what choices is the author making or the creator making, And how do those choices in the art speak without the text? You'll see that one of my approaches is to take the text out of a comic, and to just ask students to look at the art and to try to figure out what's going on with just the art, and then to put the text back in. That is something that I strongly recommend you try to do with political cartoons, political comics. That works pretty well. Anyone, Craig, I'm not sure, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, he'll do it. I think Craig is going to be working sort of underneath your
Okay,
communication.
right.
So I think we're good. Yeah.
All right, good. Well, I'll move ahead. Andy, if you have anything, tell me.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But I am watching. I was wondering how long it would take for somebody to bring up Watchmen. Also, maybe we can talk about that later. So, as long as we're teaching students how to read comics, let's teach them how to read some specific signifiers that developed in comics and that don't appear at all really in text. And we call these generally emanata, although they've got a lot of different terms. Some people just call them bits and bobs and things like that. But you've seen them. If somebody's shaking themselves, we know they're wiggly lines. Those actually have a name. They're agitrons. They're what you see in front of you with Thanos prototypically are blurgets. Those are these curved lines that show motion, that something is moving. Anybody who read Charlie Brown knows about briffits, which are clouds of dust, usually after somebody leaves. We'll get back. Also from Charlie Brown, of course, are endotherms. Endotherms are fantastic. They're little wavy lines that show that you're hot, but they can also be wafterons, which show that you're smelly. If you think back to Poor Pigpen in Charlie Brown, you'll see what we're talking about. So all kinds of little signifiers there. And you can have students draw them. You can work with them as drawn figures first, and then have them try to describe them. A whole bunch more here. They're fantastic. Luke effect, of course, is one of my favorites, because how do you show something shiny? You use a little window. How do we know that a little window means something is shiny? Is it because we see one of those and it immediately becomes obvious to us because we know what windows do? Or is it because it's a convention that we get used to over time? My favorite, of course, is this poor drunk guy getting progressively more drunk. I don't know if you can show this in your classroom, but when he's only slightly drunk, he's just got little squeams around his head. Show a student that picture and say, do you know what's going on here? And then as he gets drunker, he has a spurl that shows that he's really getting quite dizzy. The spurl, it's obvious what a spurl is, but the thrush on top when he's really, really drunk, that's an unusual one. Why would a birdie be up there? What does that mean? How did the authors decide that's what they were going to use? So this is another level of communication that students can pick up on if we ask them to read slowly. Now, something I want to say is that in American comics in particular, often even motion doesn't use these kinds of emanata. Japanese comics, manga, often do. And European comics, if any of your students are reading Tintin or things like that, they often use these kinds of signifiers. But you won't find them in all comics, and that's because we have these different traditions. And I mean, American comics really tend to use fewer, especially the sort of superhero world. And then beneath this is, like, I think, an even more exciting level of learning by thinking about abstraction and realism. So here I want to feature Shigeru Mizuki's work. Shigeru Mizuki is a great post-war manga creator who created thousands of pages in a row for Shonen Jump and some of the other great manga magazines, especially aimed at boys. And at a certain point, he decided he wanted to tell his story and the story of Japan in the Showa regime, which is the regime that extends through much of the 20th century. And just take a look at these two pages for a moment, because they're beautiful pages. They reflect an almost hyper-realistic, but certainly a realistic style that isn't really manga-like at all in many ways. It shows an appreciation and a thoughtfulness around what even in Japan at the time that this was created was considered to be serious art. But then these manga-esque, somewhat abstracted, cartoonish faces get in there. On the left, in a page in which he's talking about a war between the kids in his village and the next village over. And you can tell because of this that this is not a serious thing, right? Despite those backgrounds, this is fun. But then if you look at the page on the right, you see the Mukden incident and the actual invasion of invasion of Manchuria by the Japanese Kwantung army. This is serious. It's clear. Everything about this page tells you to read this as something that is really serious and meaningful on sort of a societal level. And yet these two pages are next to each other. I once asked one of my favorite creators, Mark Bennett, why he chose to do the Civil War Diary of Freeman Colby with essentially stick figures. So Bennett finds this diary, beautiful diary, in a courthouse, essentially, in New Hampshire. I have this vision of a very small sort of village courthouse because I live in California, and that's how I envision everything in New Hampshire. And that it's sort of got old wood, and he's able to open a drawer and find this sort of old diary. And it's a story that is about a young man going and spending, the first half of the Civil War doing just about nothing, like most soldiers did, sitting around, getting sick, getting diarrhea, but also doing some sneaking off, that sort of thing. And then in the second volume, it gets very serious indeed. It's about war, it's about reflections on slavery and things like that. And I said to Mark, how come you decided to do this in such an abstract stick figure kind of way? And he gave me 5 answers. You only see 4 of them. That's because I wanted to keep one as the punchline. But the first is, he said, look, I didn't know what people really looked like, so I drew them in stick figures because that seemed more appropriate. There's a historical veracity issue here. And Mark's just one of many creators I've talked to who say, I didn't do something because I didn't want to do violence to the past. Ari Kelman, in Battle Lines, which we'll talk about briefly, said something similar about not putting words in the mouths of famous people. He didn't want to do violence to the past. And then Mark said, things that are abstract are accessible. And he said, I can draw them really fast. I didn't want to spend lots and lots of time. And I was really sort of sleep deprived and tired. And then the final thing he said is, I just draw better this way. It's just my style, which is kind of a letdown after having 4 good explanations to talk about up ahead. But all of these things do play in. When you get someone like Joe Sacco and you look at a Joe Sacco page, Joe Sacco has spent 4 or 5 days on that page. And that's only sustainable if you're Joe Sacco. And so a lot of comics work has to be faster, but there are also intentional decisions as to why one would go abstract. I just mentioned Jonathan Federvorm and Ari Kelman's Battle Lines, and let me then move on to this, one of my favorite arguments about history made in comic book form. And I see my time is getting short, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it. But I just wanted to say, look for a second at the argument being made here. There are plenty of words, but it's the art that's doing the work in the end. Why did the Civil War happen? It rests fundamentally on a very unstable foundation. The American contradiction of a country established for liberty and yet a country that has slavery. You know, I told somebody recently to look at this panel when they were in the middle of a debate about the 1619 Project. And, you know, for me, it's that contradiction you need to understand. It's not just that there was slavery. It's that there was slavery in a land that proclaimed itself to be a land about liberty. So helping students to go through these pages and annotate them can be an immensely rewarding experience once you've given them the tools to do so. Here is Miriam Kitten's We Are On Our Own. Amazingly, it starts with text, really, text that students can't even read. It's in Hebrew. Not many of your students can read Hebrew unless you're teaching 14-year-olds. You have enough Jewish students who haven't forgotten the bar mitzvah portion yet, the way that I had by the age of 15. It begins with the book of Genesis, let there be light. right? And we see the darkness receding away to the light and God dividing the light from the darkness. And then on the next page, the opposite happens. It's the literal coming of darkness as the Nazi insignia, the swastika, in front of that window slowly grows larger and larger and blocks it out. And on that page, even the panels represent the window panes, as you can see. So the construction of the panels there being very important as well. The size of everything being very important. That one picture where all the text is, that one panel where all the text is, being kind of not a focal point, but a central point in transitioning from the coming of light to the coming of dark. Camille Bernstein, I assume your wow has to do with this particular page. It is, I think, an incredible page, and you have to work really hard in reading comics to find pages like this. There are lots of ho-hum mediocre pages or pages that need more interpretation than we can give them without being experts. But just every so often you come upon a page that really just works like this. I'm going to go quickly through this last point, which is that time does weird things in comics, and that's an advantage as well. Normally, the text goes forward in an almost linear fashion, and the pictures, the images, the art can go forwards and backwards almost independently. This is the way we normally conceive of it. Camille also just brought up Chris Ware. Chris Ware doesn't do that. Chris Ware does whatever Chris wants, but always thoughtfully. I think of Chris Ware as the E.E. Cummings of comic books, because Chris Ware knows everything so well that Chris Ware can break the rules. For most of us, we're not there yet. If you want to talk with your students about the way that time works in comics, you can do a lot worse than these two pages, these two panels from Scott McCloud. In this first panel, we see a lot of action, but we don't know whether it's all happening at the same time or sequentially. And in this next panel, we can see that it's sequentially because we have the words, right? So reading the words helps us to know one thing coming after another, but also because the gutters that are put in there give us a division that read sequentially tells us is actually happening over time. One of the places where I really see the page being used really creatively around time is again with battle lines. And I call back to it because what Jonathan Feder-Vorm and Ari Kelman have done here in one chapter in Battle Lines is they've made a page that's sequential without time actually passing, and a whole chapter in which each page is happening after the page before, but the panels are representing three different views of what's going on. This is actually the riots that broke out in New York, anti-war riots, but also racialized riots in the middle of the Civil War. And what you see on each page is on the left, the experience from one perspective, and that always uses that slightly green color in the background, and that's working class rioters. This middle class kid in the middle, caught in the middle, who doesn't really understand it, lots of grays, and then more yellows and sometimes brighter colors on the right, representing the experiences of African Americans who are the subject of these race riots. So here is a page that's not constructed chronologically or sequentially, even though there are three on the page.
May I ask you a quick question, Trevor?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is the first example you've given of a graphic history that has been authored by a duo. And Ari Kelman's a wonderful historian. UC Davis. I don't know Jonathan, but the implication here is that there's an historian providing, really grounded, accurate, vetted history, and then perhaps there's, I think, again, I don't mean this dismissively. Jonathan's far more than an illustrator, but there must be somebody with sort of the graphic novel skills. Yeah. Is that true? Is it that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Makes this so special is that there's that combination there?
Right. Yeah, and that's and we see more and more of that because There are, and some of them aren't that great. There are plenty of historians who are doing graphic novels who don't love comics and who script something up and then expect the artist to deliver it, and artists don't always like that. That isn't what happened in this case. So yeah, the history comes from Ari, who, as you say, is a great historian of the Civil War, and the art comes from Jonathan. On the other hand, we know how many drafts they went through, or at least they tell us how many drafts they went through, going back and forth, fighting back and forth, arguing about how to represent something, you know, and the process was educative for Ari, and that Jonathan taught him the kinds of things that we're talking about today. And that can happen in the best situation. But, and I've said this again, I just get too many graphic novels, graphic histories that are really illustrated histories, where the art isn't doing the work. And you know, I would not want to teach those, because as we'll see when we get to these exercises here, if the art's not doing the work, you're not really, I think, enjoying this, really getting at the richness. So yeah, so there's a question from Brooke Covington here, about using a graphic textbook in the first year writing course. How do you ensure students take comic book textbooks as a serious medium that is worthy to close scholarly attention and analysis? This is a good question. I don't know if anybody else wants to reply. I will just say this. I have not had a problem with my students doing that. I've had a problem with my colleagues and former department chair taking it seriously. I haven't really had that problem, but that is because we spend a lot of time talking about these kinds of things, and setting these kinds of things up so that it's clear that they should take it seriously. I do think that when students don't take comics seriously, it's because it hasn't been fully set up to them, how they should approach and decode this kind of work. So there's my final message in this section, which is, as I promised earlier, read slow. And you know, I mean, I just want to reemphasize again, we are teaching students that when they get to college, they're going to have to read really fast and skim, and it's going to get worse when they get to grad school. So learn how to do that. And there's a value to reading slow as well, and to teaching students to read slow. I wanted to just talk about 4 ways to use a graphic history in the classroom before getting to the exercises. And again, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. And it is a shame that we can't really sit and look at each other as we and do the exercises. We're not set up to do that here, but I'm hoping in your classroom you'll find them useful. So I'm going to describe them. But first of all, we read for decoding, and I ask students sometimes to go out and do research. This is from Marcela de Salate's Run for It, also Angola Janga by the same author, Brazilian comics that have been recently translated. Sometimes a little confusing as histories, but full, just replete of codes. And I have my students read outside about the kinds of symbolism that were common in Congolese society and then in Afro-Brazilian society, and ask them to pick those sorts of things out, and why they're placed in a particular place, and just to sort of decode in that way. I use comics as primary sources as well. Those of you in California may or may not know about Henry Yoshitaka Kiyama's The Four Immigrants manga, which he drew mostly after he returned from the United States in 1924, but it's about the Japanese American experience. I think that there are parts of that textbook that I use just because they're so relevant to my students at San Francisco State. And we're able to talk about those experiences and why they're relevant. But we do it by talking about the art as well as the text as sort of symbolic of what he's trying to express of his experience. A third way that I use it in my classroom is to get students to read for historical empathy. I get so sick of students reading about Africa and wanting to talk about Africa as in the middle of a crisis, or a place that has to be saved or anything like that. And my cure is Aya of Yop City, which is about a young African woman, right, in Cote d'Ivoire in the 1970s in Abidjan. And it's about love. And it's about thinking about sex, and it's about school and liking school and hating school and parents and the problems that parents bring and friends. Um, and it is in many ways historically situated very beautifully in post-war and mid-20th century Abidjan. But the people are so relatable as everyday people with everyday lives. Um, and again, you can do that with other media. But with comics, you can have students do that by looking at the color that's being used, by looking at the shots that are being used, by looking at the way that people's faces are being drawn, or the implements that are being shown in the courtyard. And you can tell them, I want you to learn about this setting in a way that you wouldn't learn about necessarily in a written form. You can see how people stand. You can see the kinds of clothes people wear. You can see the kinds of buildings that are there. What does that teach you that may be kind of reading against the grain, but still sort of there? And then we read Mouse. But I have to tell you, oh, I'm not going to get to Mouse yet. Um, we read for narrative. I ask students to look at how a story is constructed. Jason Lutz is one of the masters of narrative, I think, in this medium. And here's Berlin, which is a book about socialists and Nazis clashing in the 1920s. And that, of course, reaches a climax, as you might think. The storytelling over the next few pages is incredible, and it's storytelling almost without words. It's storytelling that uses the way the panels are situated and the kind of, I don't know what to say to you, the rhythm as you go through the page. It's a very small, sweet story. Um, Mom has just come home and she's preparing the kids to wake up, and she's slowly and lovingly mixing things for them. And you can take it slowly and look at each panel. And on the next page as well, it reaches sort of a crescendo point at the end of that second page, when the family is able to sit in what is clearly a featured panel here. The perspective is on them as a loving family, almost in a Renaissance again artistic way, although with their backs instead of their fronts. Um, and then on the next page, the story builds, but it also is transformed as she goes to a socialist march. And towards the end, we see the march getting louder, things getting a little ominous with the shadows. And then the next page is the climax and also the denouement. But I don't show them that page. I have them draw that page, right? What is going to happen next? Finish the story. But we can spend half an hour or more talking about the storytelling on just these pages. Um, okay, right. The final thing I wanted to say, um, I I I actually often don't assign Mouse, but I do use Mouse with particular students that I want to do independent studies with. And Mouse is amazing because it's not really a book about the Holocaust, although you can use it to study the Holocaust, and you can look at the pages where Spiegelman decides he's going to be very realistic and concrete because he wants to show the crematorium at Auschwitz. He wants there to be no doubt about it. Um, and yet it's really a book about trauma, and hence the masks, right? And hence the question of who is a mouse and what does it mean, and hence the relationship with his father. And I find that it's a great book for students to work through historical trauma um, as they're kind of thinking about their own lives even, and where they're coming from, and what the past means to them. And that is how I use it. And that does allow me to use things like this page in which Spiegelman is a mouse, real mouse, and his mask is tied on, just like his therapist's mask is tied on. But his father, who comes back and forth into the shot sometimes, is always a real mouse. And what is Spiegelman trying to say about himself and his feelings about not actually having gone through the Holocaust, and his survivor guilt, really, at not having experienced what his father experienced. So I've talked too long. The workshop is going to be short. Please, if you have questions about what I'm saying about how to use these different things, do put them in the chat and I will read them. But let me just give you 7 or 8 tools. The first tool, I ask students to draw a happy line. hey, you know, they almost always draw a mouth that's smiling. But we talk about what a happy line looks like. And an angry shape, they almost always draw something that's jagged. Um, a block, okay, they know how to do that. And a block that's moving, so how do you show movement? Or a block that's shiny, a person that's hit their head, a person being concerned. How do you show that on a face? And there's no such thing as not being able to draw, by the way. If you can draw a square, a circle, a dot, you can draw here. So this exercise simply gets students to understand that art signifies. I just have here two small projects, but one of them is actually really important. The first is the pass around project, where you just fold a piece of paper into 4 pieces and you have students take turns creating the panel, the balloon, drawing in the panel, and then writing text in the balloons. And Camille, I'm glad that you love it. It does help students to understand the different parts and the way that each part can speak. The upload a page project is my go-to, right? How do you get students to take this seriously? You tell them, while you're reading this at home, find a page you love, snap a picture of it with your phone, and upload it to the course management website or email it to me or whatever. Hey, Sue Ellen, this is very similar, having your art students draw lines to music. That's actually a great way to make it even more media. I love that. But so the upload project, they have to then come to class and tell you why that page. And many of them will start by saying, I just like this page because of the content. But then other students can help them work through the way meaning is expressed in that particular page. Or I tell them to upload a single panel, either one. And then they're showing their work. They're talking you through. And of course, first you have to model doing it yourself, but this is really very effective, I've found, project. I've included in your packet something that I actually took from New York City, which is using graphic histories in all of their passports, new passport curriculum, which meet the new Regents exam. This was done by Kim Young, who is a high school teacher herself. Kim Young is fantastic. I know that she worked with Joe Schmidt in New York City to develop this. This is a great little way to help students, without learning all the jargon necessarily, to just go through a page in 3 steps. You know, the first of which is just to observe what's going on. The second of which is to think about it and analyze it a bit, and then to sort of bring it all together and to think a little bit about the meaning that the author is trying to express. That
it really does seem, Trevor,
I did not make this.
Yeah, it really does seem that you're addressing some of Camille's comments in a nice serendipitous way, which is giving students training wheels to understand how to go slowly and go step by step to understand these complex texts. And it seems like these kinds of structures, while they may seem scripted to our adult eyes, are actually exactly what kids need in order to develop those kinds of habits of mind.
I mean, I think so, right? I'm just learning. I'm just learning from the teachers that I'm working with myself right now. But what I'm learning, I'm bringing into my college classroom. I have to tell you, they respond to it in much the same way, and I think equally well. And you know, taking the time to do things like, you know, this is one of Nick Susanis's exercises. So I don't know if Craig put up earlier Nick's spin, weave, and cut blog. If not, I've got it at the end here. But there's an education page in there. And you should pay attention to that education page. It's got a lot of his stuff and the stuff that other people do. Here he's asked, without words, he asks people to just sketch out their morning and think about how they divide up their morning and how they show it on a single piece of paper and what's going on in each case. And this helps students to understand sort of the rhythm and design of a page. I'm going kind of fast because I've got 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that if there's a couple minutes left over. This is again from Kim Young. At a presentation we did together, she showed me this, and she says it works great in her classroom to give half the students the text and half the students the images, and to ask them to fill in the other half, and then to bring them together. And the reason this works great is because students need to understand the work that each is doing. and then can talk about the way in which we can communicate better in images or text, depending on precisely sort of what you want. Nick Susanis, when he has students really annotate a page, it's incredible. And he's got a lot of examples up. I don't think we can all reach for this. This is his college level class in the humanities department on how to create comics. And he's spending months on this. He doesn't have to hit much content other than how to create comics. We can ask our students to annotate. We can find different ways to work with them to do it. I showed you an annotation that I do on that Jacques Tardy's book that's very, very simple, just pointing out the differences between the two pages. But if you do want to do a project that's as advanced and sophisticated as this one with your students, you're going to learn from Nick Susanis' visual analysis project. And I don't mind saying that. Hey, Annie, I don't know who Wendy Pillars is, but I'm going to look at that, look for that myself now, because it sounds like a good resource. Okay, obviously, get students creating. I happen to use comics in a book about historical memory. Sorry, in a course about historical memory. I had my students identify something significant that happened in their lifetime. It was about 5 years ago, so for half of them, it was 9/11. The other half used all kinds of different things, very personal things. And then to think about what their thoughts are or how they experienced it, and then to create a comic about it. That's what I would do. And Ginger is pointing out that Google Book Creator allows for students to do this. That's right, and that's another wonderful resource for doing just that. And yay, my last panel here. Sorry, it's not a panel. I'm in PowerPoint, not comics. My last slide here, just reminding you of some of the things that I think you should take a look at. One that I've got up there is a YouTube video called How to Design a Comic Book Page. And although it sounds like that's sort of didactic, it's not. What it actually is it is a decoding of a single page from mouse. That is one of the greatest decodings I've ever seen. Kind of a video annotation of the page in the same way as Nick Susanis's project. And you should, I think, take a look at it. So Scott ended up saying, before we go, could we share some of our favorite graphic histories for children and teens? I think that's a great idea. I also, by the way, I saw this earlier, Hazardous Tales series by Nathan Hale, and yes, those are fun and very classic in many ways. I think that's great. And folks, put yours up as well as we go along here. But The Best We Could Do by T. Bui, and for me, that's one of the most exceptional memoirs in terms of working with multimodality. I think if you want students to engage like a modern mouse, in that it's a personal journey as well as a broader sort of journey of questions of immigration, I think that's fantastic as well. The Arrival, boy, somebody will remind me of the artist's name for The Arrival, which is also about immigration, has no words at all, is somewhat fantastical, and yet, thank you, yes, thanks Scott, Sean Tan. Boy, is that one of the most exceptional things you will ever see that can really express the immigrant experience through art, and art that is very, as I said, fantastical, almost phantasmagoric, another world, and yet so very, very meaningful. I think it's exceptional as well. So other folks will perhaps put up what they really love. There are only 5 minutes left, and I'm kind of done with my presentation. And Andy, what should we do next?
Well, I'm going to invite everyone in the audience, as they have some thoughts or some questions, to continue to share in the chat box, and we'll bring that in. I'm going to give you a chance to catch your breath. Trevor, you've shared so many wonderful resources and approaches. I often say in these webinars and the work that we do at the center that the humanities is a is a tool. It's a necessary tool to understand our world. It's very, very complicated, and this is just another tool. And I acknowledge Brooke's comments. Brooke, a wonderful grad student at Virginia Tech who's worked in our summer program, but the comment of how to transition to dispelling the misconception that graphic histories or comics are somehow superfluous or silly, or sort of takes us back to that Chutes and Ladders image in which the comic was the escape as opposed to being a really sophisticated text. And I wonder if the sort of Marvel Universe blockbuster movie is a part of that as well, just kind of adding the wrong connotation with words like comics and graphic histories. And I wonder if when you work with your own students, Trevor, if you're able to dispel that quickly because of you and your background and who you are and how you describe it, or if you have some go-to ways in which these other non-experts in the graphic novel can puncture that misconception.
You know, it's a great question. I mean, there are a couple of things. You know, I start out by giving actually a history of the comic that's really global, that's really multinational, and one can quickly show the way in which comics are taken very seriously in a number of different places. There's some great readings out there. There's some great books that that do things like take very seriously the sequential signification systems of you know, Central Australian Aborigine peoples that go way back, or that look at Japanese engagement with manga and comics, or French or whatever. So that's one thing. Another thing is I do refer students to the fact that in our own discipline in history, graphic histories are being taken very seriously. But I'm also very open to them to talk about the way in which the discipline of history and the way it's been changing. I see the attention to comics being the same as the attention to the inclusion of women in history. You know, I mean, all of these things are shifts from an older conception of what history is to one that's perhaps more open, but that still has sort of some need, some rules around it, if you will, and some intellectual sophistication. You know, that's probably all I can say right now about that.
In terms of resources, it seems like graphic histories in some ways are able to tackle big, complicated, overwhelming topics and issues like the Holocaust, Civil War, etc. And I don't know that there's a central clearinghouse to answer Leslie's question, which is, if she has a particular topic in mind, whatever that may be, is there a place she can go and find a graphic novel, graphic history that goes, for any topic? Is there a clearinghouse search way to find something in the topic she's interested in?
So not that I know of. There's some best graphic history or best graphic novel lists, some of which Scott Smith put up earlier. Craig put up as well, some that have awards. I can only say in the minute or two that we have left, if you can put up the topics, any topics that you're interested in. I have a whole wall behind me. I mean, I'm also happy to sort of email you about them. You know, I made one graphic history because I wanted to about 7 years ago, and because I had tenure and I was allowed to take that risk. And suddenly everybody decided I was the expert on this topic, and I still feel like in some ways I'm not. But it has meant that everybody sends me their graphic histories. I'll also say that there are dozens out there that have not yet been published because they're expensive to do, and publishers don't really want to take a risk with them. I have in my folder online, I have about 6 completed African history graphic histories that serious people have sent to me that should be published that aren't published yet. Hopefully we keep moving in the right direction and we see these sort of soon.
I'm curious, final question, it's a little bit sideways, but we've done a lot of work at the center with a scholar in the music department at University of Virginia, a guy named A.D. Carson. He's up there with Sarah Radke at UVA, and A.D. did his dissertation as a hip hop record. His specialty is hip hop scholarship, and I had a similar conversation with him, and I'm curious, little bit of a sideways question for you. Are you aware of any scholars who are currently doing either dissertations or publishing, maybe not tenured folks
Sure.
like you, but publishing their work as graphic histories as opposed to writing about graphic histories?
Um, well, first of all, most of the people that I know who are doing this work have tenure, and that's just the fact. You know, we all know why that is. But so Nick Susanis's Unflattening was his dissertation at Columbia Teachers
Great,
College,
great.
or at Columbia. That's the only one that I know right now, but I'm sure there are more, or there will be more. Partly because Unflattening won so many awards that it just made him sort of a household name in our kind of world pretty fast.
Trevor, thank you so much for your conversation tonight, all the wonderful resources that you modeled and displayed. I'm going to encourage everyone in our audience to follow Trevor on Twitter, keep an eye out for the work that you do at conferences, the works that you publish, and I'm going to take your invitation for them to contact you as not being an idle one, and I hope they're able to reach out to you if they have questions.
Absolutely. And if you email me, you'll get the fastest respond. On Twitter, I'm a little bit slow, to be truthful.
Fantastic. I also want to thank Craig Perrier, who has done a wonderful job as a TA tonight. He's been shadowing the conversation. He's been adding lots of different resources into the chat box. I'm going to save the chat tonight. There's so many great URLs. I'm going to save that, and we're going to email it to all of our attendees in the next day or so. But I might invite all of you to go up and just kind of do a big cut and paste of the whole chat box so you can catch all those URLs. I hate that I don't think the recordings actually show the chat box, and so I want to make sure that we maintain that conversation. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. Please do follow the National Humanities Center on social media. Our Twitter and our Facebook feeds are probably our most active. Also go to our website and sign up for email listservs. I suspect most of you are already there because you're in these webinars, but please do share that with your colleagues, share the resources and the recordings of tonight's session. That recording should be posted in the next 2 days or so. Our next session in the National Humanities Center webinar series is on January the 23rd. We'll be working with Emily Wilson, who's a professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and her session is titled Teaching the Odyssey in Translation. In just a moment, I'm going to open the end of webinar survey. Once you complete that survey, you'll be able to download your certificate. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great day at school tomorrow. We'll see you next time with the National Humanities Center and the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.